particularly honored to be sitting with three very, very good friends, three men I admire in so many ways. Khalil Shikaki is actually one of my favorite characters in one of my books. So let me first introduce the panel, and then I want to ask them to tell us a little bit more about the substance of this extraordinary book, which I encourage in many ways for people who are not thinking about the classroom. This is something that is such a wonderful resource for anyone who's interested in the Arab-Israeli conflict and understanding the broad range of opinions and events that have contributed to what's unfolded over the past century. So, to my left is Khalil Shikaki, who is professor of political science and director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in Ramallah, a place I've visited and which does an extraordinary work. Since 2005, he's also been a senior fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University, where he has collaborated with Shai. He earned his PhD in political science from Columbia University in 1985 and taught at several Palestinian and American universities. For several years, he served as Dean of Scientific Research at Najah University in Nablus. Since 1993, Khalil has conducted more than 200 polls among Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And what this bio doesn't say is that he was the very first independent pollster in the entire Arab world and was way ahead of the curve in 1993 in doing the early polling on how far Palestinians were willing to go. And he has been way ahead of the curve as well in working alongside Israelis and trying to take the message of the peace process to an American audience. To my right is Shai Feldman, who is the Judith and Sidney Schwartz Director of the Crown Center at Brandeis. He's also a senior fellow and member of the board of directors at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, where he serves as co-chair of the Middle East Security Project. For several years, he was head of the Jaffe Center for Strategic Studies at Tel Aviv University and served as a member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Issues. He was educated at Hebrew University in Jerusalem and did his PhD at Berkeley. He's the author of 5 books, this being the most recent. And to my far right is Abdulmonim Said Ali, who is chairman of the board and CEO of the Regional Center for Strategic Studies in Cairo. He's also a senior fellow at the Crown Center at Brandeis University. And he's chairman of Al Masri Al Yom, which I think was the first independent newspaper in Egypt. It certainly was always known for having an extraordinarily independent voice, something quite refreshing. Previously, he was president of Al Haram and the Center for Political and Strategic Studies in Cairo, and chairman of the board of Al Haram newspaper. He was a distinguished fellow at the Brookings Institution and was a research center also at the Belfer Center at Harvard. He also is the author of a long list of notable publications. So I want to start, we kind of did this morning a little bit in reverse when we talked about the critique of the book. I really want to get into a little bit of the substance. And I also want to begin by asking each one of them, as they talk about the book, to tell me about how the Arab-Israeli conflict played out a little bit within their relationship in navigating this terrain, writing a book together, in figuring out how to make it work and to have one narrative, 3 narratives come together in one. So Shai, do you want to start, or do you want?
Maybe I'll just say a few words because I said a few words earlier. Let me try though to say a few words about in relation to the discussion that we had before the break. You know, there are references and Asher made that point, you know, very well. about the dilemmas of the classroom dealing with the issue, this hypersensitive issue called the Arab-Israeli conflict. But there's another dimension to the encounter in the classroom that in many ways has, in many ways, the particular structure of the book, and particularly what by necessity we had to omit, results from, which is to say, to be economical about what we can say and what we can't say in a book that's already, with everything that was pointed out about what could be added to, it's already 460 pages. And that is not the size of the book, but as much in terms of the classroom, how difficult it is for people, all three of us we've already emphasized that we worked together for somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 decades. But that also means that we lived through the conflict. I still remember as a 6-year-old, air raids around the 1956 war, and my mother carrying, or at least pulling in my case, and carrying my, at that time, 1-year-old sister to the air raid shelter that was close to our house in a town called Rehovot. So 56 is already in my memory, let alone 67, 70, the war. I was a soldier during the War of Attrition, 70, 73. Okay, so now, and all three of us, and Abdul Munim will elaborate a little bit later, I'm sure, have lived through this. Now, imagine that we had to, when we write this book, remind ourselves constantly that we teach in the classroom students that if they're juniors this year, were born the year of Oslo. Born the year of Oslo. So the 2006 war, which is referred to as the Second Lebanon War, for me it happened 2 weeks ago. For the students that are now taking our class, 2006 is something that they vaguely remember some reference to, and so on and so forth. And Asher, I'm sure you have the same experience. So again, and this is really where, yes, we come short on depth and comprehensiveness, because we constantly have to bear in mind that the students that come to our class, they're really tabula rasa, and they haven't lived through any of this. And so you have to give them the initial tools, and hopefully, if the class is exciting enough and they want to learn more, then they will take it from there and find ways to learn more. We had in one of our first classes, we had an Arab student who was so, I would say, inspired to learn more, and particularly to learn more about the narrative side. An Arab student who graduated Brandeis that year, a semester after she took our class. And her first job, she applied and she was accepted for her first job, was in Washington, D.C., in the Holocaust Museum. Now, why would an Arab student look for a job in the Holocaust Museum to be her first job if she wasn't, in a sense, inspired to try to learn more of this narrative? So all we try to do here is, in a sense, plant the seeds of greater intellectual curiosity. But of course, we couldn't do much more than that. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say. The second, and I think Asher actually made that point, that is the whole issue of the U.S. role, which is, of course, critical on one side. But I think Asher made the point that the fact of the matter is that, and maybe actually that's a sign of a certain degree of maturity, in my mind, among Israelis and Arabs, that they didn't feel the need to attribute to outsiders an equal weight. And I think that, and I will go one step further than Asher did, and I would say the reason I call it maturity is because, and this is actually one point where I think narratives evolved over time, because there was a very strong tendency in the 1930s and 40s and into the 50s, both by Arabs and Israelis, to blame the outsiders for everything. So Israel was a colonial project, and essentially Britain was responsible for the Arab plight because the Balfour Declaration and everything that in Arab eyes the British did to help the Zionists build their institutions, build their self-defense forces, and so on and so forth. The Jews, and the Zionists especially, had exactly the opposite narrative. But it focused again on Britain. Britain provided the Balfour Declaration, and there's a Zionist narrative of betrayal, because the Zionist narrative emphasizes the white papers that limited immigration to Palestine, and especially its vicious, or it's very critical of the British role after 1933. Right? So after 1933, the Nazis come into power, and the Jewish communities in Europe come under huge pressure. And how could the British, that offered what they offered in the Balfour Declaration, limit immigration in a situation where the Jewish communities were coming? And you could almost see people stretching the line from there to the Holocaust. Now, I think that what happened in the last 10, 15 years, or maybe 20 years, is that both Israelis, beginning with the new historians, and more recently Palestinian historians like Rashid Khalidi, are saying, we had agency here. You know, it can't be just the externals. So the fact that I think that Arabs in Israel, at least 2 Arabs and 1 Israeli, wrote the history of this conflict from the perspective of Arabs and Israelis primarily, where the others come in at the systemic level and the regional level and so on, but are not as central as the Arabs and the Israelis themselves, I think is a sign of maturity, not of the 3 of us, but I think of actually of the parties at conflict that say to themselves, you know, in the end of the day, it's our decision. And we have agency here, and we can't wait for others to solve this problem for us. My last comment is about, I don't know if Asher made that, raised that point, about solutions and the fact that we didn't offer our own solution to the conflict. Actually, I think that, Asher, you made the point earlier in your comments that one of the advantages of this book is that you can't put a label on it. I actually think that if we tried to, in one book, also offer our solution to the conflict, it would have made it easier for people to put a label on it. So because we tried to in fact, do exactly what you pointed to, which is to make it very difficult for people to put a label on this book, we, I think, consciously decided to yes, of course, the whole book is about the conflict, and we make some, I think, observations about what it takes, but not to offer a blueprint, because that would have made it much more easier to put a stamp on us.
Thank you. I hope the kids in your last class at the end of your semester at least get to ask you what do you guys think the solution is. Khalil, I do want us to talk a little bit about the substance of the book too. We kind of leapt into the criticism without going into what it's all about and what you're trying to achieve. So if you want to talk a little bit about that. I'd also love to hear just a little bit about this personal, you know, the chemistry among you all, how you achieved what your own countries haven't yet achieved, or the Arab-Israeli conflict has not yet achieved. So if you could do those 2 things, I turn over to you.
Thank you, Robin. Let me start by saying something about the panel. I have learned a lot from the speakers. I think their comments were insightful, and they did raise very important issues that we have not ignored. We've discussed among ourselves during the process of writing the book. Sometimes we made deliberate choices, and those choices led us to where we are now. And in some ways, our most important goal, however, was what they described as the positive contribution of the book. This was our most important objective. We realized from the outset, as Aaron said, that we're biased. Three of us are biased. No matter how we try to be objective, we simply cannot be objective. So how do we address this issue? And one way of addressing it is, of course, by having the three of us in the book. So when the three of us worked together, we checked each other's biases. This was one, and so every time we sat in all these sessions, our most heated arguments were in terms of helping ourselves understand our biases and therefore distinguish between what is a development in the book, given the structure of the book, what should go in development, what should go in narrative, what should go in analysis. And that certainly, I believe, has been one of the most important guiding principles for our work, is that to ensure that we realize our biases, one, two, that we therefore ensure that the readers can distinguish between a development and a narrative. So that is, so having the three of us authoring the book was one way in which we contributed to the goal of the Crown Center, to have a balanced and dispassionate discussion about this issue. We also help the students understand the difference between a development and a bias by clearly putting borders, erecting borders between what is a development, what's a narrative. So each section each chapter is divided into these chapters. So students can see our description of what a development is. But then they also, there's therefore some repetition in the book, when we then introduce that same development, but through the eyes of the participants in the conflict, the three participants. Thirdly, we also were careful to distinguish what I said earlier between a descriptive statement of what actually happened, what we think actually happened, and Asher is right, of course. This it's extremely difficult to say this is undisputed fact. There is nothing called undisputed fact. It's, as Shibley said earlier, we now learn something about what happened at Camp David we didn't know before. So whatever facts we now consider undisputed are certainly things that historians and authors in the future will dispute, and there are things that they can dispute today. But this is what we decided was undisputed. However, we thought it was important that students also see the difference between our descriptive statement of the developments and our analysis of the developments, that they should see that distinction between explanation and fact. We explain the fact without affecting our description of what actually happened. So the analysis was more to give insights, and students can, therefore, if they want to, look at the explanation and develop their own narrative of what actually happened. What is this book is about? Well, it's the two or three themes that run through all the chapters are about understanding its resilience, why this conflict is so difficult to resolve. So the resilience issue is one that we trace in each chapter, and the conclusion, we address this issue. We sort of make conclusions about why it is resilient. And the second question is why at times we managed to solve some aspects of this conflict. So there too, from those cases where we succeeded, we then made conclusions. So chapter 13 is about those conclusions. What worked, what did not work, in terms of the substance, but also actually in terms of teaching the students about how to analyze conflicts. What was the relative importance of the various levels of analysis? So we end up, therefore, giving the students the benefits of having looked at all these cases, all these in each chapter. They look at all these three levels. So when was the U.S. role really decisive? So they can see that. When was domestic politics the most important? When was the outcome, in fact, nothing but the triumph of domestic imperatives? That is where they can see that. And when were leaders the most important, the most critical players? They can also see that. And that helps them when looking at current developments. This is not about predicting the future. It's about understanding what actually happened. Of course, those who are well-informed can look into the future if they know some of the facts. So the third, of course, question that we've been grappling with is, so what is the trend? I mean, we know it is resilient. We see that it has at times been resolved. But when you look at 100 years, what is the trend? And the trend, and we conclude that the trend is that the conflict has become more amenable to solution, that it is easier today to solve it than 50 years ago or 100 years ago or even 20 years ago. So that is the overall trend. And in that, when we conclude, we then say something about what it will take to resolve it. So we do not address other solutions. We just look at this solution that we highlighted from chapter 1, which is partition. From chapter 1, partition keeps coming into the picture until the end. And in the conclusion, therefore, we cannot introduce new ideas that have not been examined. We're now trying to say, okay, so over 100 years, this partition solution has been at the table and the parties have been grappling with it. Now, what it will take to solve it in that way, to solve it through partition. And now, if I may just respond to some of the critique.
Briefly.
Very briefly, which I think has been excellent and insightful, and I'm grateful for the comments. There is, if you read the book, you'll find that the U.S. role is there in every single chapter, maybe not as much in chapter 1, but certainly in all the other chapters there isn't one external factor that we've examined that had received as much attention as the U.S. role, because we three of us fully realize that, and we agree with the panels that this is the most relevant and most important external or systemic factor. We couldn't give it a role we couldn't give a fourth narrative because we didn't know what the fourth narrative is. We needed someone who would do that, but our focus was more on the actors' own narratives because we wanted to see how these narratives changed, because that was important for our conclusion as what will it take to solve it. And therefore, it was more important for us to assess the narratives of the parties than to assess the narratives of the U.S. The U.S. came into play in the conclusion in terms of what will it take for external powers? What do the for example, what do we want more or less American involvement? So the book, looking at all this period, comes out at the end with a conclusion about what kind of role the U.S. should or should not be playing. I'll answer some of your other questions later.
Okay. Abdul Maneem, Khalil talked about figuring out what worked and what didn't, how often and when leadership plays a role. Can you give us some of the headlines from the book, some of the conclusions that you all came to about, that give us a sense of what you discovered among the three of you in talking about this extraordinary conflict, the world's longest ongoing conflict, so that we have a sense of some of the substance in the book as well?
Well, I will do what Shai and Khalil did. I will talk first and then answer your question. Actually, I want to convey to you my, 2 points, basically. One is the whole book is a tale of human experience. And I think I will start by saying we started by having a very fun time working for that book. To get you just some of the sense of it, we started by Shai Feldman putting in front of us always an Oreo pack that was big. So we decided to call it the Oreo project. So, and we have to go through a lot of colors, we wrote together. So it came, I don't know how come, that I write in green, Shai will write in blue, and Khalil will write in red. I won't take any psychological reference from picking up the color, but I know as we proceeded writing, more colors came in, and we don't know which draft was really the one that we are working on. However, moving from fun, it became confusing sometimes, about, how to deal with issues. And all the points that Khalil referred to, and raised by the critique we had earlier, realizing what are the boundaries. But luckily, we were complementing each other in a variety of ways. And I don't think, despite of the intensity of the discussion that we had, that we came into a point of, blood boiling or anything. But we complemented each other in many ways. The original structure of teaching, I'm coming from out of the teaching profession, writer and researchers, basically, and working in the media field. Both of them taught in universities. So Shai put the first 13 months, kind of what we are going to teach in a sequential kind of an order. And we consulted about it and about the references we should put. I think when we started the first class, I arrived the night before, so we didn't discuss it much with Shai. I decided that we have to tell the students that we want to deal with the Arab-Israeli conflict as if we are dealing with the Indian-Pakistani conflict. I mean, to deal with it as a conflict, and as such, we have to bring in all the tools and methodology coming out of the IR field, from deciding the level of analysis. So Waltz came in, crisis management was all the literature related to it, decision making, and the role of leadership, individual level of analysis, which I think it was crucial and related to many fields like political psychology and other fields. So we have here, a beginning in which was added to the skills of Khalil Shaqaqi. Khalil is most empiricist among us, and hence he was very valuable, not only in the different parts, particularly the Palestinian one, but also in contributing to the analytical part on deciding first or proposing before we come into the discussion, what are the independent and the dependent variables into that kind of situation. And here we were really got to be very balanced and dispassionate. And I think the three skills of us came into that issue of working on how to analyze the situation in such a way not to get into a sense of causality, but to get into a sense of how things are linked to each other. So that's, in general, I will say that the human side of all of us, how we work to come up with this book. On the substance, I like to say, first I will thank all, the three critiques of this work, and I think I felt they have been very soft on us on doing the analysis. But some of the points, it come with the turfs. I mean, in any project, you got to make trade-offs and decide, on what to take off or not to take off. And I remember, at the end, we have the volume is bigger than the publisher wanted. And I got the job, try to reduce the manuscript as much as you can. And the journalist in me here, journalists are ruthless when you decide on the space. I mean, you can be heartless in taking things off, in which if you are a researcher, really every 2 lines are really considered detrimental if you take them off. So we in so doing to come up with it goes with the turfs, the idea of you got to make trade-offs, so something will be missing, and I think we must have missed something or some things. So that's number one. That's understandable. However, I must take a little bit of an issue with how much this book can be predictive in many ways. And I believe that, of course, the book related to our personal or collective biases. But I will take a little issue on that in the sense that assumptions starts with people making such assumptions in any issue that we have to study. And we learn it methodologically. We don't question the assumptions. We question if they can lead to a certain types of results and make an explanation to a very complicated political reality. And I believe that the conflict, actually, we made some, progress in how to make it projectionable in a way. To decide that the conflict has moved from being existential conflict to a non-existential conflict. And as such, being, amenable to solution, I think it's opened a lot of fields of inquiry in order to find out these solutions. Unfortunately, it's not only up to academics to do that, but it's up also to politicians. I want to also add something about what Dan Kurtzer said, and I think he put something that's morally important, and I think I will tell him we don't have much answer to that one. He said that not all narratives are equal, and there is something, about that. Yeah, you can't decide which narrative is right. And as he put it, can we take the Nazi narrative about, Nazi Germany as being just a narrative? And here that is a very moral, important issue that comes to the picture. Particularly, the three of us are touched in different ways by the conflicts. The three of us were soldiers fighting in our own armies. We have been involved in the business of the Arab-Israeli conflict almost, the good part of our lives. And we want to have fought thinking that we are into a very unjust cause. We thought we are into a just cause. So actually, one of the issues that we have, for instance, one of the conventional wisdom on the Israeli side is the idea of the few against the many. That is the tragedy of the Jewish history, being the few always the exceptional against the many around them of different faiths, different nationalities, different environment. Anti-Semitism actually tend to be those who are against the Jews, not the rest of the Semite people like me. So here, we have, that's a conventional wisdom. However, from the Arab point of view, it is actually the few that always oppressed and used and exploited the many. So the Arab complex is completely the contrary to the Jewish one. And we have to grapple, we like it or not, with the morality of such situation, and even with the equality of such, equation. So here, I think probably the assumption that not all narratives are equal, in our case, that's what we exactly did. That we started by all narratives are equal because they are as such to their proponents and their people who work with it. So I believe that's we tried our best in this work in order to offer students something not only representing all the views in a mathematical way, but also a logic in understanding it and dealing with a new situation that will come after that.
Can I do a round of questions here?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, because then I want to open it up to and let the audience participate as well. But I want to do one more quick round, and I want to begin with Khalil and ask, how do you take what you learned in doing this book, the template you developed on this conflict, and apply it to what's happening today, to Secretary Kerry's very ambitious, and some people think it's naive, some people think it's, adventurous effort to finally get an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians?
Well, again, the book aims at explaining rather than predicting the future. So explaining the past is much easier because we know the facts. Here we don't know all the facts. However, if one looks at the template, they're trying to look at the outcome of the current round as one of the turning points of the conflict, whether success or failure. We can take the lessons we have learned so far. One of the lessons we have learned, of course, is, for example, the role of leaders. And we have concluded that leaders who are motivated and who are pragmatic are ones who are more likely to make deals than leaders who are not pragmatic and ideologues and who are not motivated. This by no means sufficient or necessary to resolve a conflict, but it is certainly one of the important factors in explaining outcomes. And assuming that the systemic level is permissive in the sense that it is not one in which one of the main regional or international players are obstructing or delaying or spoiling. If we look at the international system today, we certainly find that it is one that is permissive. It is certainly not forcing the parties. At times, the international system was forceful in pressing the parties to do things. In this case, it isn't. So we assume that, I would assume today, that as Secretary Kerry is trying to resolve a conflict, that he comes with ideas, but he is certainly not putting his hand and saying, I will not take no for an answer. He's not doing that, and he's not even putting ideas. He's just bringing the parties together. This is not an environment, therefore, where the international system is decisive. It is certainly permissive. The regional system is also permissive, and perhaps even encouraging the main spoilers, who in the past have played a significant role in preventing agreements, whether it was Syria or Iran or the Soviet Union in the past or Hezbollah, have been weakened. So regional actors are weakened. There is, when you look at 100 years of conflict, you can see that the regional environment has mostly played a negative role. Today, it isn't actually playing a negative role because of the spoilers have been neutralized and because of their own preoccupation with their own turmoil, but also because in the Arab world, the Arab Peace Initiative has made things a lot easier to resolve the conflict than at any time before. There was no such Arab Peace Initiative at Camp David, for example, when the parties met last time with a great international and regional involvement. When you look at the domestic environment, you can clearly see that it too is not compelling. It is not pushing the parties, domestic Palestinian, domestic Israeli environment. They are not pushing the parties to an agreement, but it's not blocking one in a very significant way. There are impediments. This is not as easy as it is out in the international and regional system. On the Palestinian side and the Israeli side, public opinion is supportive. Technically, the Palestinian leadership is in control of the PLO, and in the Palestinian Authority, they have control over the security services. If they want to sign an agreement, the likelihood that the public will support it is great. And even in Israel, even though that this is a right-wing government, technically speaking, again, there is enough votes in the Israeli Knesset to pass an agreement that Netanyahu signs. He does not need to go to new elections to approve an agreement with the Palestinians. Nonetheless, there are significant opposing forces, particularly on the Israeli side. And there are opposing forces on the Palestinian side. Hamas and the split between Fatah and Hamas is certainly an impediment, but Hamas has never been as weak as it is today. So the balance essentially is one that says the domestic environment is not pushing for an agreement, but it's also not strongly preventing one. So that's why leaders become important. In such a context, leaders become very important, and the question is, are they motivated? Are they pragmatic? Looking at the picture, it's not balanced. On the Palestinian side, maybe this is my biases now, on the Palestinian side, I see Abbas more pragmatic. I see his achievement with Olmert 2008 as impressive, very impressive, in fact. So I see him creative. I see him a real pragmatist. But he's not very strongly motivated. His own legitimacy is being questioned. He has lost his electoral legitimacy. He's not going to go for a deal where he would make compromises more than what his public can take because of the question of legitimacy. So the motivation is not as great as it would have been. If this was Arafat negotiating from Tunis with the PLO legitimacy as great as it was at the time of Oslo, this would have been a different picture. This is not the case. 20 years of PA, 20 years of the PLO becoming seen by the public as weak and corrupt and so on and so forth has made it extremely difficult for leaders to lead. Now they have to look at their back and see what's happening with their public. Similarly, on the Israeli side, actually it's much worse. We have a right-wing leader with ideology playing a significant role in his thinking, ideology and hawkish views about security, the ideology about the Jewish nature of the state, and so on, and maybe even more. We still don't know. And his motivation is even weaker than that of Abbas. He doesn't need an agreement with the Palestinians to win the next elections. He can easily now win the next elections without an agreement. In fact, maybe even without an agreement, the likelihood that he would win the next elections are even greater than with an agreement for Netanyahu himself. So the motivation is much lower, and his pragmatism, I would say, is less than that of Abbas. Overall, therefore, if I look at this picture, what I've said about the international, regional, the domestic, and the leaders, using the template in the book, I would say the chances are not great.
I have to say that was the most thoughtful, insightful, and helpful analysis of where we stand that I think I've heard. I hope you write it. Tremendously helpful. Did you want to weigh in on that as well? I
Yeah.
also want to ask you to address the bigger question of, look, the book's in English, and yet the three of you have audiences in Arabic and Hebrew that might benefit even more from this book than an American audience, especially since, you know, we haven't included the American narrative, which I think was a wise move, actually. But so I'm interested. Is it going to be translated? Are you trying to take this and use the example that can be applied in the Middle East and potentially even beyond?
Okay, so a few comments on, and I think that my main comment in response to what Khalil said is that the disagreements that we might have actually highlight the difference between what we try to do in the book and applying it to what is happening now. Because we have not actually sorted out,
Mike.
we've not actually tried to sort out for November 20, 2013, where exactly are we at these four levels? The international system, the region, the domestic politics, and the leaders that we're talking about. Now, since Khalil has taken us to November 20, 2013, because you asked him to,
That's my job.
I will say this, that I don't disagree with Khalil on the international system, which is to say the U.S. primarily, and the lack of spoilers in the international arena. And the region, I think that Khalil pointed to the fact that people or factors in the region that were in years past spoilers are now basically either weakened significantly, or they're so completely consumed by their internal problems that they can't play the spoiler role that he had. However, I'll just point to one thing, which is that when we talk about the region's impact on the Israeli side, then all the factors that Khalil pointed to are correct, except for that there's also one other dimension to this, which is for some Israelis, what's going on in the region is simply scary. And when you see the environment and you don't understand it, and you're scared by it, you tend to hunker down, and you tend to say, boy, I mean, I don't have the foggiest idea how to calculate the risks that I would be taking if I did X, Y, and Z, because everything in the region is in complete turmoil. By the way, that's number one. Number two, everything that is happening in the region was not predicted. Not predicted by others, but also not predicted by Israelis. Okay? So, you know, maybe Mubarak didn't feel that he would live forever, but most Israelis somehow believed that Mubarak would live forever. Okay? And then all of a sudden, all the assumptions about the region have changed. And so that's one aspect of this. And the other aspect is simply the degree of carnage. I mean, you know, because when you talk about, you know, Arabs and Israelis coming together and making peace with one another, and then you see what Arabs are willing to do to one another in Syria, you know, for the average Israeli, that's just scary. And when it's scary, it makes it easier for those who are against making concessions to say, how in the world are you going to make these concessions when you have no idea how to calculate what the risks involve, because look at what's going on in the region. So I would add that caveat. The last element, and this is where I think maybe we disagree a little bit more, is on the role of leaders. I'm just, I guess I'm sensitive to the fact that we have erred so many times in the past in predicting individuals and the possibility that they will change their course. I was Abdul Munim mentioned my military service. I was in the Israeli military both during the war of attrition, but also that coincided the period when Nasser died and was replaced by Sadat. And to me, again, because I'm not a 20-year-old junior, to me it's like it was happened yesterday. And I still remember how everybody, and I have to say the Israeli intelligence community, but I think that was common to other intelligence communities, totally, completely underestimated Sadat, okay? So, and nobody anticipated the dramatic turnaround that Sadat would make. And I would also say, frankly, as an Israeli, if you asked me in 2003 even, but early 2003 or even mid-2003, that in December 2003, Sharon would give a speech in which he will adopt as his narrative the word occupation, in an effort to try to explain to the Israeli public why in the summer of 2005 he would take Israel out of Gaza and take the settlers out and so on and so forth, I would say, remember, Sharon's narrative for all these years was Netzarim is like Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv and Netzarim are one. So any settlement in Gaza was equated to Tel Aviv. And 6 months later, he faces the audience in Herzliya and talks about occupation. So now I would ask myself then, what are the opportunities here? Is it possible that Netanyahu would make an about face? Now, the easiest is to say, no, there's no chance in hell. But I would just point to two things about this. Number one, and I don't always take everything that Netanyahu says for granted. Far from it. But I would grant two things, I think. Number one, I think that Netanyahu, again, may not have walked the full distance as Sharon and Olmert and so on and so forth. But I think that Netanyahu, if there is one thing that I think he's genuinely convinced about, is that if there is no solution, if there is no two-state solution, there may not be a one-state solution, but there will be a one-state reality. That the default option is one state, and the one state is a disaster because it essentially undermines everything, all the reasons why Israel was established in the first place. That I grant him. Number two, which is the reason why I think that, another reason why I think he's genuinely concerned about this, is because Netanyahu believes in the importance of legitimacy. And this is why he's worried about signs of questioning Israel's legitimacy. But I think it's precisely because of this that he sees a one-state reality as a disaster, because I think he understands that Israel's international legitimacy is based on one document. It's the November 29, 1947 UN resolution. And that resolution was about two states. Now, if the reality takes us away, which is the reason why you see the bird is flying away, it's almost out of the, it's almost flying away. So if the two-state solution eventually flies away, then the basic document upon which Israel's international legitimacy rests fades. And I think that Netanyahu is genuinely worried about it. And I will conclude by saying one thing, which is, so here's where I differ with Khalil. I don't think the problem is with Netanyahu being less pragmatic, certainly not less pragmatic than Mahmoud Abbas. The problem I think that with both leaders is not so much whether they're pragmatic or not. I think both of them are pragmatic enough. The question is whether they have the strength of character, okay? The reason why the Sharon about face was so important was not because he changed the direction, but with Sharon, when he decided something, no matter whether it was putting the settlements in place or dismantling the settlements, it was with equal strength and equal vigor. And this was the times when there were Sharon faced the same dilemma that Abu Mazen faces and Netanyahu faces, which is the numbers are favoring a resolution of the conflict. But the minority is committed and is mobilized, and it's willing to go to great lengths. And with just last sentence about this, which is any leader who tries to calculate what he can do and cannot do cannot completely separate from himself from one other aspect of the historical heritage, which is the two important peacemakers were assassinated. Sadat was assassinated, and Rabin was assassinated. And I don't think that any human being can completely erase it. So here's where the strength of character is absolutely essential. That's where I have question marks about what can be done today.
Okay, Abdul Munim, I want to bring in the situation that is changing everything in the Middle East, and that's the Arab Spring, or the Arab earthquake as is now being called, and how that changes the dynamics and introduces the issue of uncertainty, whether it's the civil war in Syria or your own transition in Egypt, which some growing concern about Jordan, the refugee situation that's destabilizing that whole neighborhood. Tell us how this is affecting the current attempt at peace and kind of the givens about the Middle East. I mean, we've all looked at the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict, as kind of part of an equation, and the variables have never been so volatile, so pervasive, and so numerous. If you could reflect on that for us.
Let me just state two basic fundamental changes that we are living through. Number one is that we lived on the assumption that the Arab-Israeli conflict is shaping the Middle East in a variety of ways. Of course, everybody recognizes there are other factors. However, the Arab-Israeli conflict was very, very important. In many ways, all the changes that took place in the 1950s, the role of the military, the role of intelligence, the role of the media, the rise of nationalisms, particularly Pan-Arab nationalism in the region, all that was a byproduct, partially at least, of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So the Arab-Israeli conflict was shaping particularly the Arab region in a certain way for almost 60 years. Now we have the opposite, I guess, that the changes that took place since January 2011 in the region, I believe they are going to reshape the Arab-Israeli conflict. It will be the other way around. And not only because, people are busy with revolutions and busy with spring and winter and falls, but also because there are, in many ways, another look at the way politics are. Politics has been, in a way, very classical in our region, very responsive to the Cold War, is based on what will make our societies more mobilized, more capable. It was based on fear, basically. I think with the new structure of the changes that are taking place in the region, a new way of thinking is going to emerge. Actually, it is emerging, and we may elaborate on that if we have time. So first, I will put that on the table, that the environment, the Arab Spring, with all the reservations you can make, is going to shape certain kinds of events. A second major structural reality, and here I will differ with Ruben, about the role of Islamists in the whole saga of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Because I see that the Islamists, out of what I have said, are not coming because they already came and they failed, and I think they are, as I may predict, they are leaving. So we have something here fundamentally there, and I think it will, a lot of scholarly work will be, put into it. The Islamists came to Sudan, came to in the region to Iran. The Islamists came to Afghanistan. They came to Egypt. They came to Tunisia because we have 3 revolutions actually took place in the last 3 years. The first one is to get rid of, or try to get rid of the legacy of the 1948 war, which brought the military, the mobilizational state, fearing the Israeli enemy, and whatever, and linking it to colonialism and imperialism and the rest. So we have here the Islamists, the overthrowing it, represented that we have enough of that. We have to have a new beginning. The second revolution was the one to bring the Islamists. The Islamists came to power in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, in Yemen, and we are a very strong part of what's happening in Syria. And those were actually carrying the conflict to another pedestal, in another level, in which it became much more existential, not in terms of nationalism, but in terms of religion. What happened in the last few months, at least, not only the overthrow of the Muslim Brothers from Egypt, but the weakening of the Muslim Brothers in Tunisia. And the second thought that the international community, the regional community, about what's happening in Syria. Everybody wants Bashar al-Assad out, but everybody is asking, what if after Bashar al-Assad, we get the Muslim Brothers or jihadi groups or others? So one of the things that derailed the Arab Spring from coming to Syria, I think, was the emergence among the resistance, among the revolutionaries, and Islamic trend. So, and the legacy now, the failure in Egypt opened the whole file about the legacy of fundamentalism in general, coming out from Iran, coming from Afghanistan, Sudan. Fundamentalism led to the division of the country. And in Afghanistan, it ended up with the way of occupation of all countries of the world. And in Iran, we will find the country at the end is not really flourishing or doing breakthroughs in any of the science and technology or whatever. So here, I see that some of the forces of that was impeding the possibility of having a resolution of the conflict has been fundamentally weakened. And here I might differ with those, who will think that if we look at it from a point of view of let me say this, I distinguish always between history and strategy. I mean, in history, in which major forces that actually we don't have much control of, because many of it is coming for 1,000 years. So, however, strategy is a man-made thing, try to deal with a very specific situation like occupation, like settlements, like others. And our book actually make it clear that the conflict has changed, from being an existential one to a non-existential one. And if it's non-existential one, it's open to human intervention into it. So that kind of human intervention is got to deal with an environment that might be helpful. And I think that now the weakening of the Islamic trend is a structural thing. If you look at it from a strategic direct, as we learned strategy in schools, you might say there is no hope, because now the balance of our power is decisively to the Israeli side, because Iraq is destroyed and Syria is destroyed. And in many ways, Egypt is very busy with its own problems. So there's no any, in terms of power relations, incentive to the Israeli leadership to come to the fore. In the same time, the kind of help that a country like Egypt used to give to the Palestinians to compensate their lack of power in the balance of power is not around. Egypt is busy with a lot of things other than the Arab-Israeli conflict for the moment. However, I will say, with getting into the structural factors, weakening the Islamic trend into it will give an input, because here Hamas is weakened, and that's one of the things that's I think we're responsible about the destruction of Oslo and doing the suicide. I mean, in Oslo, Netanyahu, the militant, the guy who is on the far right, made the agreements around Hebron and accepted the Israeli withdrawal from about 13% of the West Bank. He did not only recognize the Palestinian people, but also recognize the two-state solution. So here, the suicide bombing, the whole military solution through the Intifada and other things in which the Islamists played a strong part, in addition to the Israeli extremists who killed Rabin, is not the solution. The solution is something else. And here, we have a plate full of solutions to the major problems of the day. So I won't exclude hope in looking at the future, taking the new developments in the region.
Fascinating. I'm very grateful. And lots of questions. Let's begin with these two down here. And if you please give us your name and affiliation.
Thank you very much. Benjamin To, a retired diplomat, no affiliation. In the context of the generally positive trends that the speakers identified in various ways, I wonder if you could address one specific important issue, and that has been the consistent Israeli desire to retain control of the Jordan Valley for a considerable period of time, and whether there might be some change in that concern, and also in the possibility of having some external force replace the IDF forces for some period of time.
My answer is yes.
Thank you.
And I think that compared to the other issues that are involved here, and especially big narrative issues where history and religion are involved, whether it's the right of return on one side, whether it's the Holy Basin in Jerusalem on the other side, I think the Jordan Valley is a security issue, and I believe that if the other issues if progress is made on the other issues, and if it is left by the leaders on both sides, and more than both sides, because we're not talking about only the Israelis and the Palestinians. The Jordanians are a major part of this conversation regarding the Jordan River, and also other parties who you might be able to insert, and there's discussion about NATO. In my view, if the leaders on the two sides allow the professional level, that is to say, people whose business is dealing with security, and tell them, look, here's your mission, okay? Here's your marching orders. We need to resolve this conflict, okay? And we're willing to take up to a limit, certain risks, okay? So we don't assume that there is a risk-free proposition here. You have to come back to us with some way of resolving this particular problem. It's a military, technical, strategic issue. Come back, and you have 30 days. Come back, and from my at least 30 and something years of having a sense of these professional levels, by the way, on both sides, and in this case, as I said, Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians, I don't think that that's going to be an impediment.
Well, actually, assuming that the Israeli interest in the Netanyahu interest in the Jordan Valley is security and purely security, then it is probably resolvable, but certainly not the way he is proposing it. A long-term Israeli military presence in the Jordan Valley is a deal breaker on the Palestinian side. It has always been that, and it will not change, in my view, anytime soon. In all previous negotiations, the Israeli position started with this demand, and this demand was dropped very quickly after that. And in 2008, this issue was addressed extensively, and ultimately Abbas and Olmert agreed that that this is indeed a legitimate security issue, and that the Israeli demand for security can be addressed via third party. And the two sides agreed that there would be NATO deployment in the Jordan Valley as part of a permanent agreement. Netanyahu raising this issue now creates doubt on the Palestinian mind whether in fact he is serious about a two-state solution to begin with, because he knows that this is a deal breaker, and if he is still insisting on it, knowing that it is a deal breaker, and knowing that the history of negotiations, this is why in the current round of negotiations, this is not purely a security matter, because it creates doubts in the minds of the Palestinians about the ultimate goals of Netanyahu, what his purpose of bringing this issue and insisting on it is meant to do.
We had a question, the woman right here. And then we'll take my.
Hi, my name is Farnaz Isfahani. I'm a scholar here at the Wilson Center. I actually have a quick comment. I was quite surprised to hear you say that the Muslim Brotherhood and all of these movements have failed. Perhaps the Muslim democratic political parties have failed, but Al-Qaeda is clearly growing in influence all over the Arab world. That is my comment. There are fighters from Chechnya, from Pakistan, from Afghanistan every day going into Syria and to Iraq, and there are tunnels going into Egypt, and this is a very serious problem, far more threatening than the Muslim Brotherhood, who you can arrest and declare undemocratic. But my question to Mr. Feldman about this vis-a-vis Palestine and Israel is, how much fear and worry is there on the Israeli government side that Al-Qaeda and its related groups and the way that they have gathered strength and momentum and arms and have been fueled by certain Arab countries, how much of this is being taken into consideration with the two-state solution? Thank you.
We should also mention that she's a Woodrow Wilson scholar and a former member of the Pakistani parliament.
I would agree that Al-Qaeda influence in the region is increasing. From Mali to actually to Iraq, and now in Syria, in Sinai, Libya, and even they not only as individuals came back from Pakistan and Afghanistan to the region, but also they found massive amounts of arms from Libya, in which became plenty. But on the other hand, they got a number of setbacks. We got to look at them. They got a setback in Mali due to French intervention. And they got a setback in Algeria, in which when they tried to take over the south there. And even through the only election we got or referendum we got in Libya, they lost to the civilian parts, not only the Al-Qaeda people, but also the Islamists in general. And I think the story of Sinai now, as far as I know it, they are in retreat, not into a triumphant point. It's related to a new Egyptian-Israeli understanding on how to, implement the military protocols of the peace treaty. And I think, it's no incident that the United States, when it decided to freeze some of the military aid to Egypt they excluded what's related to Sinai. I think also the awareness of Al-Qaeda component in the Syrian equation is becoming now, I think, a point of consensus. We want Bashar al-Assad out, but we don't want Al-Qaeda or the Muslim Brothers in, which is a very difficult, paradoxical situation. So despite of their presence, I think, that's something that can be debated, that the mainstream Islamist movement is the Muslim Brothers. And there are derivatives, there are Salafis and others. But those has been the backbone of all Islamist thinking, that getting back to where we were 14 centuries ago will make us better and happier. This notion proved wrong. Using religion as a way of progress or a change to more civic, democratic, we have an experience in Turkey that's looked at as being a model for moderation. However, increasingly we find a kind of a retrogression in the Turkish experience. So I will say that, of course, the jury is still out about the whole saga of the Middle East. But if we looked at the tectonic changes that are taking place, that's the most unraveling one, that the Islamists were put to the test, and they are failing. I mean, if you took a country and then the country is divided, I can't call that a success. I can't find, outside the military and the nuclear issue that Iran is progressing or getting into the, say, South Korean hemisphere in many ways. Certainly, Afghanistan is as divided as ever. And for 1 year, Egyptians who started last June in 2012, the revolutionaries of January 25th, 2011, were there in Tahrir Square saluting Mohammed Morsi and supporting him. And actually, they signed an agreement with him called the Vermont Agreement, in which how the revolutionaries with the Muslim Brothers will take the country forward. It took only 1 year to find out the fallacy of the whole experiment. And immediately, probably from December to January, the whole Tamarud movement started to grow up, and the overthrow of them took shape by a combination of 33 million Egyptians on the street, and with the help of the military, who adopted actually the Tamarud program. So here, I see that despite of we are still in the middle of this kind of radical transformation that's at the end unrelated to the Arab-Israeli conflict. I mean, people are not revolting because of the failure of leaders to deal with the Israelis, at least on the Arab side. And for a lot of in my generation's life is shaped by the Arab-Israeli conflict. I got to spend 4 years of my life in the army, and others stayed 7-8 years. Others continued to be fighters in different. So it has shaped the Israeli society in a military way. You got a lot of prime minister military people. And because actually it is a country living in fear and insecurity. So you got here that the Arab-Israeli conflict is shaping the lives of the region. Now, to the contrary, we have a new emerging agenda. We are talking not only about democracy in the Arab world, but you can't, overlook the amount of youth who are talking about all kinds of constitutions, what kind of constitutions we want. And you can go into the middle class and define, should Egypt be centralized or decentralized? I mean, issues related to the well-being is coming to the fore. And I think people know in Egypt that the fight in Sinai is happening in cooperation between Israel and Egypt. And they understand that that there is an emerging problems related to Iran, related to the chaotic situation in Iraq, that the whole region needs to reshape up in a variety of ways. That is coming through a very, the revolution of, we used to talk about at least two things, that the Arab societies and the Middle Eastern societies are changing in terms of demographic makeup, and we have a lot of youth. But we never really came up, what does it mean? What does it mean practically? That means futures matter. A second one, we used to talk about globalization and technology development, but we don't know exactly what does it mean. Now we know what does it mean. It means that the ability to communicate and debate things related to God, related to the homeland, related to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and communicate with the other side, the Israelis.
I hate to do this, but I've made the most egregious error that a moderator can make. I mean, I'm so sorry. I've gone way over. I was so interested, and the bookseller is going to leave in like 3 minutes. So I want to give people a chance to buy the book. They will be around here if anyone has questions. I'm really sorry, but I want to thank so much Khalil and Shai and Abdul Monem for an extraordinary book and an extraordinary morning.